to the war between Russia and Ukraine, Russian officials have declared an emergency evacuation following a cross-border incursion by Ukrainian troops. It is Ukraine's biggest attack on Russian soil since the war began. Russian officials called for a federal-level emergency evacuation, and people are fleeing the bombing. The Kremlin says that it is sending reinforcements to the region. Meantime, Ukrainian officials say a Russian bomb struck a shopping mall, killing 11 people and wounding 44 others. And I'd like to bring in now Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University. Charles, good to be with you today. In an interview back in February, you mentioned that it may be time for Ukraine to switch from offense to defense and to work at the negotiating table. As you see Russia declaring a federal-level emergency in Kursk because of Ukraine's incursion, do you still feel that way?
I do still feel that way, and I think ultimately this is a war that is not going to end with a decisive victory by either side. It's going to end when the two sides are exhausted and they decide that they're better off at the negotiating table than on the battlefield. Clearly, we're not there yet, but it's conceivable to me that the Ukrainians are going into Russia, going into Kursk, as a way of setting the table for negotiations. Number one, by saying to the Russians, we're bringing the war to you, because a lot of Russians don't feel that the country's in wartime at all. The other objective may be to try to grab a hold of a chunk of Ukrainian territory, of Russian territory. So when they finally sit down at the negotiating table, they may have something to trade when it comes to getting back Ukrainian territory.
Do you think Ukraine's offense, do you think it's reached its limit?
Well, if you're talking about taking back more chunks of occupied land, I think not going to make a lot of progress there. What we're seeing on the ground are fortified, thick lines of defense being built on both sides. I don't think the Russians or the Ukrainians are going to generate the combat capability needed to break through. In terms of this offensive on Russian territory, I doubt it's going to get much further, because the Russians are now flooding the zone with reserves. They're beginning to retaliate against Ukrainians on the other side of the border. So I think the Ukrainians will be hard-pressed to hold what they've already taken, and we don't even know whether they're going to try to hold it. They may pursue a strategic retreat in the coming days and use this as a way of saying, we can come into Russia and we can hurt you when we want to. Again, more of a bargaining chip than a clear military objective.
I understand that you were part of a small unofficial group that met quietly with Russian officials last year, including Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. Tell us why you think the U.S. approach to Russian-Ukraine conflict, why that should be two-pronged.
Well, I think that there needs to be more dialogue between the United States and Russia. This is the biggest war in Europe since World War II. It still has the potential to escalate either into a wider war or possibly a Russian decision to use a nuclear weapon. Under those circumstances, it seems to me the channels of communication should be open at the highest levels. I've been participating in various kinds of track 2 conversations mainly with Russian experts, on one occasion, as you mentioned, with the Russian foreign minister, as a means of trying to keep those channels of communication open. They're not official dialogue. There's no contact with the Biden administration, but I think it's helpful for Russians and Americans, even during these very tense times, to be in dialogue.
All right, we're going to leave it right there. Thank you so much for joining us today, sir. We really appreciate it.